Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We'll let people continue to trickle in. I just want to start by welcoming everybody today. So I'm Sean Fox. I'm an associate professor in global development here at the University of Bristol, along with my colleague, Tom O'Shea. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our very first Green Guest Lecture, co-sponsored by the Cabot Institute for the Environment and the School of Geographical Sciences here at Bristol. There aren't very many good things that one can say of a pandemic, but it has forced us all to adapt and to embrace video conferencing technology. And this could have some very real environmental benefits. In the past, we would have invited a distinguished speaker to physically come to Bristol to give a lecture in a lecture hall. And a virtual lecture would have felt distinctly inferior, but not anymore. Now we can connect across continents and oceans in real time on any number of platforms, and it feels normal. And so we decided to launch this series of public lectures, the Green Guest Lectures, bringing distinguished speakers from around the world to your screens to share big ideas around the intertwined themes of global development and environmental change. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Thomas Elmqvist from Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University. Professor Elmqvist's research is focused on urbanization, urban ecosystem services, land use change, natural disturbances, and components of resilience, including the role of social institutions. He's a global thought leader on the challenges of sustainability and resilience in our increasingly urban world, and we are delighted to welcome him as our inaugural speaker for the Green Guest Lecture series. And he's going to speak on the topic of urbanizing in and for the Anthropocene. Professor Elmqvist will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. Please type any questions that you have using the Q&A feature down at the bottom of the Zoom window there. And you're welcome to type these in at any time during the lecture while Professor Elmqvist is speaking. Also, for your information, please be advised that this session is being recorded. And with that, I will hand it over to Professor Thomas Elmqvist. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sean. I feel very honored to have been invited to give this lecture, although in a way I like to have this virtual because of the low carbon footprint, but perhaps at some other time there will be an opportunity to visit Bristol as well. I've been in Bristol before, and it's really, I've enjoyed spending my time there and with students and professors at the university. So anyway, thank you for inviting me. I feel very honored. And today I'm going to talk about the urbanization and the concept of Anthropocene and go a bit behind to get a deeper understanding what we actually mean, what Anthropocene means, and how we could actually manage urbanization in this new era we are living. So just to give a background on why we are using this term Anthropocene, it has come out of a wide body of research from the IGBP program, and based on multiple analysis of databases, which came up with this series of figures that show that whatever variable you look at, you have an accelerated increase from approximately 1950 up to today, where the acceleration continues. So this was first called the period of great acceleration, and now we call it the Anthropocene, because we know that behind these drivers is a very strong human imprint. So we have, of course, the increased human population as one of the important primary drivers that would also have indirect effect. So on the left side, you will see a lot of examples of drivers of change, and on the right side, you will see the impacts, and they also showing this accelerated development from approximately 1950 up to today. And within this context of the great acceleration, we also have, since the 1950s, an increasing pace of urbanization. And it shows a rather strong pattern. So the initial analysis of this was done in 2004, and then they repeated the analysis in 2015, and could show that over that 10-year period, we had a much stronger urban dimension to the variables, and also a shift towards the global south. So I think we could say when we look at for the next 2 or 3 or 4 decades, we will have a similar strong trend of an urban dimension, and particularly in the global south, that will influence both the drivers and the impacts. And I talked about human population as one driving factor in the Anthropocene, and also the urban population, which is expected to double between 2010 and 2050, mostly in the global south. So, for example, Africa and India will be the areas in the world that will show the largest increase in urban population. This will, of course, have consequences, and this is visualized by this figure, where we look at the area of urban land we have built in the last 6,000 years, and the projected urban land area to be built up to 2050. And that's sort of a massive increase, and a lot of investments will in the future go into urban development. So one of the largest sustainability issues is actually how we could manage these huge investments in urban development in the future. So I will, in the first part of the talk, I will dig a bit deeper into, I think, 3 very important concepts that would contribute to address the question of how can we manage urbanization in the Anthropocene. And those concepts are the concept of sustainability, resilience, and transformation. And we did deal with that in a paper that came in the journal Nature Sustainability a couple of years ago, where we tried to clarify, because there was apparent quite a bit of confusion around these 3 concepts, and particularly how they interact and relate to each other. So we started with the conventional views that was expressed, for example, in the work, the new urban agenda that the UN Habitat proposed and was adopted, and also in the Sustainable Development Goal 11. There was a lot of discussion, also all the documents around the Sustainable Development Goals on sustainability. And it turned out that in most of those cases, sustainability was interpreted as increased efficiency in resource use. Which we think is quite a narrow definition of sustainability, but that was the one that was put forward. And resilience was equally quite narrowly defined as capacity to recover from disaster. When you use these quite narrow definitions, you end up in actually that these 2 concepts might show trade-offs, and I will exemplify. So we could envision a self-organized network with high redundancy. So you have many different nodes and links. So these could be anything. This could be people. This could be organisms in an ecosystem, any type of network. When it's self-organized, you have high redundancy. You have many different pathways between any 2 of these given nodes. If you want to make this more efficient, you would design it perhaps in alternative ways. There are alternative ways of designing, but all of those will be characterized by having a low redundancy. You have very clear and limited number of connections between nodes. So here you're going from self-organized high redundancy to designed and low redundancy, and you will call this process efficiency. You increase the efficiency. And to the left, then we will define that system as less sustainable. We make it more efficient, and then we call it more sustainable. However, it's an apparent trade-off with resilience, that you actually are losing resilience with increasing efficiency. And this is something that needs to be addressed much more, particularly in the urban context, that sustainability is too often interpreted as increasing efficiency in energy use or resource use, water use, and without acknowledging that there are many different ways you can do that, but many of those ways will also result in that you lose resilience. So in fact, you could construct this figure where you on one axis you have less or more sustainability, and on the other less or more general resilience. So if we start in the lower left, business as usual, where sustainability and development has mostly happened is going upwards to high efficiency systems, optimization, zero waste, circular economy, and a regulation-based governance system. But we need to realize what we actually want to go is in the upper right corner, which will be characterized with different parameters. So in that case, we will not sort of prioritize high efficiency. Rather, we will design and intentionally introduce diversity, redundancy, and connectivity in the system. We will have much more cross-scale perspectives and much more of a polycentric governance system. Interestingly, you could also look at the sector in the lower right, which would be characterized by more general resilience but less sustainability. And again, when sustainability has quite a narrow definition. So those will be very local, bottom-up management, self-organized type of activities that are not connected on larger scales. So that led us to expand the definition of sustainability and actually resurrect the original view of sustainability that was published in the Brundtland report already in the early 1990s. But we have, which took a very strong equity dimension. So we want to define sustainability in the urban context as ways to manage all resources the urban region is dependent on and enhance integration of all subsystems in an urban region in ways that guarantee the well-being of current and future generation, ensuring distributional equity. So that's a much broader and deeper definition than just increasing efficiency. And resilience, we want to define as the capacity of an urban system to absorb disturbance, reorganize, maintain essentially the same functions and feedbacks over time, and continue to develop along a particular development trajectory. And so sustainability, in our view, then is clearly a normative goal. This is the vision for society. This is something we have sort of political process to decide on and develop further, while resilience is a non-normative attribute of a complex system. So this is actually something that we could measure, and we could also manage. We could intervene to increase or decrease resilience, but resilience is just an attribute. It's not good or bad per se. It depends on the context. We also try to clarify the relationship between resilience and transformation, because also in these UN documents, there was quite a bit of confusion around these concepts, and some viewed resilience and transformation as rather antagonistic, that resilience was maintaining what is as it is, while transformations would represent rather abrupt changes to something completely different. So we constructed this visual to illustrate that there is actually a very constructive relationship between all these three concepts: sustainability, resilience, and transformation. So on the lower axis here, you have time from present to future. On the axis to the right, you have low sustainability, and on the top, high sustainability. And the blue lines will represent these development pathways. So a society could be developing along a specific pathway. And the vision for society is to develop along as high sustainability as possible. And there are these different alternatives. What you see around those blue lines in light brown color, that is a tunnel, is illustrating the resilience. So resilience could be wide along this pathway, or it could be very narrow. When it's wide, the system will be tolerant to mistakes and experimentation. So you could actually bounce around in the system without having the risk of falling off and entering a more negative development. So in a lot of cases, having enlarging resilience would be a good thing, because it would allow you to experiment, and it would allow you to also to make mistakes without catastrophic consequences. So that what is illustrated in to the left in the figure: directed transformation and adaptation, which will occur when you have a relatively wide tunnel around your development pathway. To the right, you see an example of where there's been a transformation, where the system has moved from a lower pathway to one higher up. So there's been a desire to move from lower sustainability to higher sustainability. We argue that this is probably could only happen in the context when resilience and this tunnel is very narrow. So you actually have a possibility to change the system from a lower to a higher. And we call this abrupt transformation. And we'll go a bit into detail. So what will happen in this case is that there are some necessary conditions that need to be there. One is strong bottom-up pressure, collective action, reducing resilience of the existing system. So it's actually possible to transform. And on the upper side, you need an attractor, like innovation in technology, institutions, financial mechanisms, etc. And very often you would also need external forces, like some biophysical external force, economic or policy drivers. So just take an example, a transformation we're right in now. When it comes to transport system, we're moving away quite quickly now from a fossil fuel-based system to a more non-fossil fuel-based, mostly electric driven vehicles. So these three conditions need to be there: that there is a bottom-up pressure to reduce the resilience of the existing system, which is the fossil fuel industry and the car industry. You need a lot of pressure to be able to change. There's a lot of rigidity and resilience in that system. But you also, at the same time, you need this new technology. You need these electric vehicles and the infrastructure. You need institutions and financial mechanisms. And you might also need some external force that would actually push this transformation to go a bit more rapid. So a global carbon tax, for example, could be something that could really turn this into a rather abrupt transformation. So another dimension when we talk about all these three concepts, resilience, sustainability, and transformation, is also scale. Usually we will address this in a local urban scale, but it's really important that we also look at other scales, the regional and the global, and investigate how they are connected. So particularly in the Anthropocene, we need to move away from just focusing on urban sustainability to focusing more and more on sustainable urbanization, how actually the process could be made much more sustainable than what it is currently. And just to go into then some of the characteristics of the process of urbanization in Anthropocene. And I will pick three, which I think are important. One is shifting diversity, another one is shifting complexity, and a third one is shifting modularity and connectivity. These are not new by all means, but the scale and the pace with which they are changing and affecting systems is. So if we first take the shifting patterns of diversity, so you have a timeline here from left to right. So we used to have a system where you had very much of a local supply of, if we take, for example, food. So you had a relatively modest diversity at any given local place. And in ecology, we will call that having a low alpha diversity. So at any local place, diversity will be quite modest. On the other hand, if you look at the larger scale, like the global scale, you would have a high beta diversity. So these different local diversity patterns will be very different from each other. So that is in contrast to the situation very much we have today, when wherever you are in the world, and you could take food as one example, but there could be others as well, information systems, for example. You could find a very high diversity of food coming from all parts of the world. And so local supermarkets will tend to be highly diverse. But then when you go look at the global scale, they tend to be quite similar. You have the same type of suppliers going to all different parts of the world. So in that case, you would have a very high alpha diversity, high local diversity, but low beta diversity. So when you scale up, the diversity goes down. And we need to understand the consequences of this, and what does this mean in terms of sustainability and resilience, and where exactly we are in this development, and what actually could be done, how we could intervene and make the process and the development more sustainable. Another dimension here is shifting complexity. So, and this would be familiar to all of us now, that, for example, supply chains, we have discovered how extremely complex the supply chains are. And in the Anthropocene, in a globalized world, we would have often quite long and very complex supply chains with many, many steps between the source and the end user. And the third, shifting modularity and connectivity. So this will illustrate how, for example, cities are connected through flows of information or trade. So to the left, you would have an early phase which would be characterized by high modularity and low connectivity. So you had relatively high connectivity locally, but much lower in between. So this will be a phase, pre-globalized world phase, where most of the trade was local or regional. Then you go through an intermediate modularity and connectivity phase to where I think we are today, in a highly connected world with very low modularity, where we are highly connected globally, but poorly connected locally. And again, I think we are being reminded of that today with all the challenges we have with supply chains, that we are perhaps over-connected globally and very poorly connected locally, which makes us vulnerable. And I think one example that was really striking, and still the effects of still could be felt throughout the world, is when this gigantic ship, Ever Given, blocked the Suez Canal in March this year for a week, and a significant part of the world trade suddenly just stopped, and there were major disruptions in the supply and in the flow of global trade and commodities. So I think those three dimensions are really important to understand, and also we need to have this deeper spatial analysis. So when it comes to understanding the Anthropocene, when it comes to data analysis, I think we could say that on a local level we have a pretty good understanding, and also at the global level. But there is an in-between level, the intermediate, where we have a rather poor understanding of the connectivity, modularity, and connections, and also how we could actually intervene and govern those interactions. So I think that this would have consequences for two important areas. One is exploring to what extent it's possible to develop more of a multi-level governance, where you don't have just governance on one level like national, but you include the local and the above the nation state, the regional, and even global. We would need a much better understanding of that intermediate level, and also understanding the supply chain complexity in the world. We would need a good understanding of all these three, the local, the intermediate, and the global. Talking about the urbanization and Anthropocene, we must, of course, address climate change, and particularly now in the UK, where you have this COP26 coming in just a couple of weeks. And just to note that on the agenda of the COP26 will be, which I think a very important issue, on urban adaptation to climate change. So in previous COP, there's been very much focus, rightly so, on mitigation and measures and for mitigation, how to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. But I think this COP will then be one of the first to really highlight the need for adaptation. And given the situation that even if we will be extremely successful in reducing carbon dioxide and reduce it with 50% to 2030, which now seems incredibly unlikely to happen. But even if we did that, we still would need to invest in huge adaptation measures, because the climate would change anyway. And this would be particularly challenging in urban areas. And this will be one of the important agenda items on the COP meeting. And one, of course, one important effect of climate change is increase in temperature in urban areas. And here is projections showing that, particularly in the northern hemisphere, we will suffer from very high temperatures in cities, and in Europe, particularly the Mediterranean area, will be very vulnerable. And we will be exposed to urban heat waves. We've had many over the last couple of decades. One really bad one struck Europe in 2003, where we had an enormous number of excess deaths as a result of that heat wave. So this is something cities are now deeply engaged in, and trying to find strategies to address. And one that has become on the top agenda in many areas is actually to use living systems and use the cooling effects of vegetation and trees. And in many areas, this could be quite an effective way. So this study showed that if you increase the tree canopy cover from 10 to 20%, you could decrease the ambient temperature from anything between 3 to 8 degrees, which is quite substantial. Another challenge is, of course, the increasing risk of flooding with a changing climate. And here you could see definitely change in the urban response paradigm. So the old response paradigm we could call the fail-safe paradigm, that you build dikes or dams, and the probability of failure of one of those would be relatively low, but consequences, if they fail, would be very high. And now with the changing climate, that probability of failure is starting to climb. So, and then we will have quite severe consequences. And I think we all experienced and saw pictures this summer from what happened in Belgium and Germany when it comes to flooding. So there is a new paradigm sort of growing, which is we could call safe to fail, that the probability of failure is higher for where you actually have a portfolio of interventions. So you would, to try to address the risk of flooding, you would use wetlands, you would use green roofs, you would use permeable ground, you would plant trees, you would have vegetation, and you would also, in many other ways, try to integrate living systems with built systems, with the effect that you have a portfolio of components in how you reducing the risk of flooding. And the probability of failure of each one of them might be maybe modest or higher, but the consequences if they fail are much, much lower. So you're building a much more portfolio response, and which we could call the safe to fail response. And this is happening on quite large scale. This is a picture from New Orleans taken in September 2005, devastating flooding of large parts of New Orleans with high death toll and immense destruction. So what is happening now to reduce the risk of future storms and hurricanes and flooding is actually to look at how you could build this portfolio and also integrate living systems in your sort of defense system. So what you see as red here is wetland areas that have been disappearing since the early 1930s due to gas and oil development and construction. And it's been calculated that every kilometer of wetland reduce wave height by approximately 1 meter. So now there is a huge investment in southern Louisiana to restore these wetlands and using them as part of the defense to reduce wave height. And then make New Orleans in a better place to face future hurricanes and storm events. This has been called nature-based solutions, and is now a concept that has been embraced by many cities around the world. And in Europe, there's been quite a bit of investment in demonstration projects. There are about 100 of them, and more than 200 million euros have been invested so far in projects where you try to integrate living systems with built systems to address these climate change challenges. And I discovered that Bristol is actually quite advanced. You have lots of exciting nature-based solution projects going on in Bristol, and I think it's really fascinating to see what is happening in many European cities. Bristol is one example, but then you have Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Barcelona, Berlin. There's so many where there are fantastic projects starting, and also a lot of experimenting going on, where you try to integrate living systems with built systems to build your capacity to deal with these challenges for the future. I just briefly gonna go through a couple which I think have been especially successful. One comes from Seoul, where there was a freeway built through a part of the city in the late 1960s. And this is a picture I'd looked in early 1970s. But there was a building local resistance to this freeway. It was noisy, polluting, and people thought it destroyed the neighborhood, sort of divided it up, and they just want to get rid of it. And there was actually a bold mayor in the early 2000s that came up with a plan that they actually, based on that, they actually didn't really need this freeway for solving the transportation needs. So they came up with and they decided to actually disassemble, to take this freeway down and replace it with a linear park. And this is what it looks like today. So under the freeway was an old river, which was then taken up to daylight. And then they built this long linear park connecting the neighborhoods instead of separating them. And this is a nighttime view. This has been immensely successful and as a source of inspiration. And also that this has been a way of also addressing some of the climate change challenges Seoul is facing. Another example I quickly go through is from Mumbai, where they've restored a river that goes through the entire city and restored the riparian vegetation around, making this also a linear park, and also will have the function of regulating water flow through the city. And it serves as an important ecological corridor. But what I think even more important is that it serves as a social corridor or a social connector, linking affluent and poor neighborhoods together in Mumbai, a city that is characterized by huge inequities and segregation. So this is one project will try to reverse that and link up and reduce the segregation and inequity in the city. I will end with another example, Singapore, which is a city that has grown tremendously since the 1980s, but it's also very special because at the same time it increased the green cover from 36% to 47%. And they have been quite innovative and creative in doing that, as you can see from the pictures. And so there are many green roofs and green walls and buildings that integrate living systems. But I think it's interesting to note that Singapore in 2015 was rated as the most healthy city in the world. And the connection here that they actually increased the green space area, despite that the city grew quite dramatically during the same time period. So I'm going to wind up and just say that I hope and I'm quite convinced that the COP26, even though maybe the member states will not reach the goals that have been put up, I'm convinced that the hundreds of mayors that will be in Glasgow these couple of weeks will push a lot of important issues forward, and particularly plans of action when it comes not only to mitigation, but also to plans for urban adaptation to climate change, which I think is so crucial because that's where the majority of people in the world live, and we need to adapt, but in a fair and equitable way. I think there's another UN meeting where cities will play a very important role, and that is the COP15 on the Convention on Biological Diversity, which will happen in April next year, where there will be one big theme on urban biodiversity and ecosystems as part of adaptation to climate change. So irrespective what these UN events will come up when it comes to the member state commitments, I'm very confident that the leaders for the local governments and the mayors will work really hard to make progress. So with that, I will thank you. And
that's excellent. Thank you, Professor Elmqvist. We've got a question in the chat here. In order to track the sustainability and resilience of an urban region, measurement is important. How might the geographical extent of an urban region or hinterland best be defined?
That's a very good question, and it's really hard to give a good answer on where you sort of draw the boundaries. You could use try to measure the urban impact. So that would be like a consequence of people commuting back and forth, living in one area but working in the city. But you could also have an urban influence that goes beyond that in terms of consumption patterns or something else. So it's really hard, but I think you need to define it depending on the question you're asking and in the context you are.
It's certainly one that I thought about, having grown up in California, where much of the water that supports the urban settlements in California comes from very, very far away. So the ecological, the water catchment area is absolutely enormous, much larger than
the US. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Colorado River. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you for that. Please, if you have any more questions, put them in the Q&A. Tom, I think you had a question you wanted to pose.
Yeah, I did. Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Thomas, for your really insightful talk. I suppose my question kind of centers around modernity and modernization, which was kind of deemed and continues to be deemed as being particularly necessary for continued growth in urban settings and development. Do these concepts, and does modernization as a whole contravene the goals of sustainability? And if so, does modernization need to give way to sustainability, or does sustainability need to give way to modernization? And if that is the case, what would the outcome of that be?
So how would you define modernization in this context?
So I suppose thinking about Giddens or Beck, they kind of said that risk is a necessary consequence of modernization. So to kind of put it into the context of my research, people are necessarily put at risk and develop areas are developed that are known to be riskier than others as a kind of an aspect of growth and modernization in that sense. So for continued development of these areas to generate new networks of wealth and
yeah, but I think yeah, I understand what you mean. I think there is sort of a more nuanced perspective coming, and sometimes they come from an unexpected sort of sector, and that is the insurance industry. That are looking at the long-term projections of climate change and starting to, and particularly the reinsurance industry, starting to put the brakes on these development projects in vulnerable or high-risk areas, and say this there is no way they would could defend that from sort of their business perspective. And so I think that will start a conversation on the magnitude of the risk, and if you are building a development, then you have to do it on your own risk, and because there will be no insurance industry backing you up.
Yeah. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you for that. There's another one in the Q&A here, which is safe to fail infrastructure. How can governments be convinced to adopt a portfolio response when this option might be more expensive and the infrastructure might be to mitigate events that may or may not occur?
Yeah.
Great
Good
question.
point. I mean, that's sort of a classical point. So we're talking about resilience in general. So you have to be able, in some cases, to demonstrate the benefit of multifunctionality, so that if one function fails, you could have others that will kick in, and also the long-term effect that you invest heavily in a monofunctional type of infrastructure, and when it fails, the consequences are enormous. So yeah, it's a hard discussion, and we will need sort of real life examples with good calculations on the short-term and long-term risk and the short-term and long-term costs of these types of infrastructure.
Yeah, I should also say, I think there's maybe I don't know if you agree, but I think a lot of these probably have co-benefits as well. So it's not investing in this is just to potentially mitigate something that may or may not happen. It goes beyond that, I think.
No, and I think the nature-based solution concept, they really put that high on the agenda, and cities are embracing it, that if you are using vegetation and trees to address the risk of flooding, you would at the same time address heat waves, and at the same time you could have health benefits, and at the same time you reduce air pollution. I mean, there's all these co-benefits, but we need to spell them out.
Yeah, I have a question for you, which is really about the constraints. So I agree with you that I think there's a lot of interest and enthusiasm in cities around the world for doing things differently and trying to tackle these global challenges with these real practical kinds of interventions that you've talked about today. But I'm also very acutely aware of the constraints that they face in terms of the authority that they have and the resources that they have. And I'm wondering are you optimistic, I guess, that cities will continue to be able to lead? So they seem to be leading in enthusiasm, and there are examples of creative and really positive action. But I more and more get the sense that we're bumping up the limits of what cities can do themselves, and what would need to change, I guess, for cities to be able to be more proactive problem solvers, have the things that they need to do what they want to do.
I think a couple of things. One would be that, and this is already happening, that cities are building quite strong and powerful networks. So C40 is one, but ICLE is another, but there are many, many others. And they are demanding to have a seat at the table and a voice. And I think when cities come together, they are powerful. They represent a huge amount of financial capital and interest and human capital. So I think these networks could be an important part of changing this power dynamics that we have in the world. Another is that individual cities can do a lot, but they need to link up with other municipalities in the region, because a lot of these issues you need to address at the right scale. And it's very rarely that will be on sort of the municipal jurisdiction scale, because the ecological processes will sort of operate at larger scale. So again, connecting with other municipalities, collaborating and coordinating efforts.
I think, yeah, it kind of goes back to the boundary question that we started with in some sense, right?
Yeah.
So we've got another question from Rory. I'm curious if you believe that increased local connectivity or decreased global connectivity, particularly concerning trade, might risk an increase in social hierarchy as certain luxury items become more exclusive to the highest earners.
Of course, I mean, there are sort of equity issues in all of this. And so we need a very sort of well thought through mechanisms for this development, to understand when, even unintentionally, we might create sort of huge inequity and segregation issues. So we need to understand that very carefully. And again, to address equity, I mean, that's at the end, it's a political issue where we need a strong bottom-up pressure to demand more equity in society.
Great, thank you. I'm going to conclude with just one more question so that we can finish right on time. My last question is wide open. I guess, how optimistic are you that we will be able, you talked early in the presentation about all of the urban land that has yet to be built, or all the cities yet to come. Given the global population trends and given the sort of the inevitable expansion of cities worldwide, and given the intense resource requirements for that development, how optimistic are you that we can continue urbanizing in the Anthropocene and tackle the various environmental crises that we face?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard to be sort of deeply optimistic, but I think that humans will have the capacity when really realizing the magnitude of the risks to be able to transform to a different trajectory. I mean, urban development along the sort of trajectory we had for the last 100 years would be a huge disaster and catastrophe. We need an urban development that is qualitatively and quantitatively completely different, and sort of leapfrogging into something that is very, very different when it comes to and decoupling population with consumption and energy and resource use. But I think there's an immense creativity out there, and it's our chance to tap into that.
So you're optimistic. You retain the optimism.
You have to. I mean, there is no other choice.
Well, I think that's a great place to end then. You must remain optimistic. Thank you, Professor Elmqvist. That was a really stimulating presentation and conversation. And I look forward one day perhaps to welcoming you back to Bristol.
I would love to come. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.